The Jackson Family, A Century of Isolation, Part 1. Imagine an isolated world, cut off by mountains, where one family's search for religious purity became a chilling, century-long experiment in human genetics. This is the case of the Jackson family, and their story will fundamentally change how you view isolation, faith, and the fragility of the human gene pool. Our story begins in the late 19th century, around 1880, deep in the remote heart of the Appalachian Mountains in the United States. A small group of settlers, led by the patriarch Joseph Jackson, vanished into a valley naturally isolated by extreme geographical features. They were seeking total religious solitude, resolved to cut all ties with the outside world. Joseph Jackson was not just a leader, he was an absolute ruler. He imposed 3 unbreakable, chilling laws on the small group of about 24 people. No contact with strangers. Marriages must occur only between members of the community itself. Leaving the valley was considered an unforgivable betrayal. What began as a desperate search for religious purity quickly and tragically transformed into an involuntary genetic experiment, one that lasted for 7 generations. The first seeds of decline. During the first 30 years, the community grew slowly. With no other options, marriages between first cousins became common practice. By the time the first generation passed, the initial, subtle signs of a genetic catastrophe were already observable: children with mild malformations, learning difficulties, and a tragic, high incidence of infant mortality. But it was the second generation, born around 1910, where the true nightmare began to take shape. Recessive genes, once silent and dormant, were now being duplicated through the close kinship and manifesting with alarming clarity. Children were born with congenital heart problems, extra fingers, cleft palates, and mental retardation. The absolute isolation and the complete absence of medical care didn't just hurt, it aggravated the entire situation. When we reached the third generation in the 1930s, the situation became dramatically worse. The tangled web of kinship. At this time, virtually every single inhabitant of the valley shared a significant portion of their genetic material. It was no longer simply a matter of cousins marrying, it was a genetic web so intricate and convoluted that it would be impossible to map with any precision. You had people who were simultaneously cousins, uncles, and nephews. The severe climate of the region, with harsh winters that isolated the community even further, contributed to a disturbing cultural belief: this small, suffering world was all that existed. Children born during this time grew up believing that their physical and mental conditions, their deformities, their limitations, were normal, simply because almost everyone around them presented some type of deformity or limitation. The fourth generation, emerging around 1950, was marked by the emergence of a bizarre and highly specific signature that became locally known as the Jackson mark. Children were born with a bluish coloration of the skin due to a rare genetic condition called methemoglobinemia, caused by an enzyme deficiency. Additionally, severe facial malformations became common, including underdeveloped jaws, widely spaced eyes, and malformed ears. The Collapse and the Escape, Part 2. When we reached the 1970s, the fifth generation already showed alarming and irreversible signs of genetic deterioration. Fertility drastically decreased, while infant mortality soared to a frightening 60%. The children who survived often couldn't speak or walk, presenting malformations so severe that some could barely be recognized as human. This nightmare remained a closely guarded secret, a tragedy unfolding just miles from civilization, until 1983. That year, a 16-year-old girl named Mary Jackson achieved the impossible. During a storm that damaged a section of the perimeter fence, Mary managed to escape the valley. The story Mary told seemed straight out of a nightmare. Generations living in total isolation, forced marriages between close relatives, and children born with increasingly severe deformities. The police, initially skeptical, were compelled to organize an expedition to the valley. What they found not only confirmed Mary's account but exceeded it in horror. They found about 240 people living in the valley, virtually all with some degree of physical deformity or cognitive limitation. Authorities discovered that the community had developed its own rudimentary communication system, as many members were incapable of properly articulating words. Living conditions were primitive: no electricity, no running water. Many inhabitants had never seen a car or watched television. The health and medical authorities who examined the community members were profoundly shocked. Many presented conditions that doctors had only seen in textbooks, and some deformities were so rare they didn't even have official nomenclature. If you want to follow more cases like this, which affect entire societies and reveal hidden truths, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any investigation. The confusing investigation. When authorities began the investigation in February 1983, the first difficulty was establishing the identity of each community member. No one had official documents, and the naming system was as confusing as the family's genealogical tree. Many shared the same name, making it virtually impossible to determine who was whose child. Investigators discovered the community maintained rudimentary records, primarily in an ancient Bible where births and deaths were noted. However, these records were often inconsistent and frequently obscured to hide the true nature of the relationships. Annotations often omitted parents' names or used vague terms like child of the valley for children born from particularly close relationships. One of the first witnesses to cooperate was Martha Jackson, a woman of approximately 50 years. Despite clear physical signs of consanguinity, she maintained sufficient cognitive capacity to communicate coherently. Martha revealed that since childhood, she had been taught the outside world was dangerous and impure, and that only within the family did the blood remain clean. Martha reported that marriages were decided by the Council of Elders. When a girl turned 13, the elders would meet and determine her husband. Nobody questioned these decisions. Martha herself revealed she was simultaneously the cousin and aunt of her husband, and her father was also her great-uncle. The Hidden Cabin and Deliberate Control, Part 3. The investigation faced significant resistance from the older community members. The elders, led by Ezekiel Jackson, a 70-year-old man who claimed to be the guardian of the family tradition, refused to cooperate. "We've lived this way for generations," declared Ezekiel. "Pure blood has kept us strong against the corrupted world." This declaration drastically contrasted with the appalling physical reality of the valley's inhabitants. Doctors identified a series of rare genetic conditions that had become common: Apert syndrome, craniofacial malformations and fused fingers, Meckel syndrome, protrusion of the brain through the skull and extra fingers, and various other conditions individually rare in the general population. A particularly disturbing discovery was made when investigators found what was called the House of Special Children. It was an isolated cabin where children with the most severe deformities were kept, some reportedly chained to rudimentary beds. These children, many of whom could not feed themselves or control basic bodily functions, received minimal care and, according to reports, frequently died during the severe Appalachian winters. The investigation also revealed that the community had developed its own mythology to explain the deformities. Children born with severe problems were considered marked by God as a test of faith. In some cases, specific deformities were interpreted as signs of spiritual power, and some of the most severely affected children were treated as oracles whose inarticulate sounds were interpreted as divine messages. As the investigation progressed, researchers began to realize they were facing an unprecedented case. Never before had a community that practiced systematic consanguinity for so many consecutive generations been documented. Geneticist Dr. Robert Keller described the case as an involuntary genetic experiment that revealed the extreme limits of what happens when the gene pool becomes critically reduced. The renewing of the blood. The investigation team faced a significant legal obstacle: the absence of an adequate legal framework. Consanguineous marriages were technically illegal in the state, but since none were officially registered, it was difficult to determine which laws had been violated. A turning point occurred when researchers found evidence that the community had not been completely isolated the entire time. Recovered documents indicated that men occasionally made incursions to nearby towns to acquire essential supplies. More disturbing still, there were indications that occasionally women from outside were brought to the valley, usually against their will, in a brutal attempt to renew the blood. Sarah Williams, a 62-year-old woman from a nearby town, recognized specific facial characteristics in photographs. She revealed that her younger sister had disappeared in 1952 when she was just 17 and was never seen again. "We always believed she had run away to the big city," Sarah said. "We never imagined she could be so close, living a nightmare." The investigation faced profound ethical dilemmas. How do you proceed with community members who had been victims but also perpetuators of the system? How do you reintegrate people into society who had never been exposed to the modern world and who presented significant cognitive limitations? And perhaps most importantly, how do you deal with the recently born children who needed urgent medical intervention? The Mass Grave and the Diaries, Part 4. In August 1983, 6 months after the investigation began, researchers made a discovery that fundamentally changed their understanding of the case. During excavation near the community cemetery, the remains of more than 300 children were found, many presenting extreme bone deformities. Subsequent analyses revealed these graves dated from different periods over the last 100 years, indicating the infant mortality rate was even higher than initially suspected. Forensic examinations of the remains showed consistent patterns of malformations that worsened with each passing generation. The oldest graves contained skeletons with relatively mild anomalies. The more recent graves presented extreme deformities, drastically malformed skulls, absence of limbs, and cases of conjoined twins who had not survived birth. Dr. Elizabeth Norcross, a geneticist specializing in rare hereditary diseases, was called in. Using advanced techniques, she managed to partially reconstruct the Jackson family's genealogical tree. "What we discovered is unprecedented in medical literature," she declared. "The coefficient of consanguinity in the most recent generation surpasses anything ever documented in human populations. In some cases, we're talking about individuals who share more than 70% of their genetic material." Dr. Norcross identified more than 40 rare genetic conditions within the community. Most alarming, however, was the discovery that some of the observed conditions were completely new to medical science, combinations of genetic anomalies that had never been documented before. The elders' knowledge. In September 1983, the investigation took another surprising turn when 19-year-old Jacob Jackson began cooperating extensively. Jacob, who presented relatively mild deformities and preserved cognitive capacity, revealed he had suspected for years that something was wrong. "When I was a child, I found a basic biology book among the supplies that men brought from town," he recounted. "That's when I realized that what they told us about being special and chosen wasn't true. We were sick, and our leaders knew it." Jacob revealed the existence of hidden documents kept by the elders, which included newspaper clippings and even scientific articles about genetics and heredity. "They knew what they were causing," he stated. In private meetings, the elders discussed which marriages would produce fewer monsters, as they called them. It wasn't ignorance. It was deliberate control. This revelation transformed the nature of the investigation to include criminal aspects. The community leaders had deliberately perpetuated practices they knew to be harmful, effectively condemning generations of children to lives of suffering. Further analysis of Joseph Jackson's personal objects, the founder, confirmed he already carried genes for several rare recessive conditions, including the one that caused the bluish skin coloration. This suggested the decision to isolate the community may have been motivated in part by a desire to hide a pre-existing genetic condition. In October 1983, authorities made another disturbing discovery in a sealed basement, diaries kept by generations of Jackson women. These diaries, written in agonizing detail, reported the births, the deformities, and the premature deaths. They revealed that not everyone had passively accepted the imposed system. There were reports of escape attempts, of women trying to avoid pregnancies, and even merciful infanticides. As these documents were translated, a more complex image emerged. It was not a group uniformly committed to fanatical beliefs, but a hierarchical social structure where an elite of male leaders maintained absolute control, using a mixture of religious indoctrination and physical isolation. Leave in the comments, never give up on truth if you believe that all victims deserve justice and all closed communities need to be investigated. The Intervention and Lasting Legacy, Part 5. In November 1983, after 9 months of intense investigation, authorities made the decision to definitively intervene and evacuate the community. The operation, involving medical teams, social workers, psychologists, and police, was carefully planned to minimize trauma. The 237 surviving members were evacuated and temporarily housed at a state hospital. Medical evaluations confirmed the devastating extent of the damage. 98% of community members presented some genetic condition. Among children under 10, that figure was 100%. Dr. James Harlow, coordinator of the medical team, declared, "We are essentially witnessing the final result of a genetic experiment that no ethics committee would ever allow." Authorities faced unprecedented legal questions. As there were no official records, the legal status of every member had to be established from scratch. The question of criminal responsibility was complex. 12 elders were identified as having knowledge of the risks, yet many also presented cognitive limitations themselves. After extensive deliberation, the focus shifted to rescue and rehabilitation. Ezekiel Jackson and 2 other elders who demonstrated full cognitive capacity were charged with crimes including child abuse and criminal negligence. In January 1984, the difficult process of integration began. For adults, the transition was extremely traumatic. Many never fully adapted, spending the rest of their lives in specialized institutions. For the children, the prognosis was more promising. Those with preserved cognitive capacities demonstrated surprising resilience and adaptability. Mary Jackson, whose escape initiated the investigation, became an inspiring example, eventually becoming an advocate for the rights of people with genetic disabilities. In 1985, the Jackson Foundation was established to coordinate ongoing care and support research. The genetic material collected became a valuable source for researchers worldwide, helping to identify specific genes associated with various rare conditions. The valley was transformed into a natural reserve with a small memorial, a reminder of our collective responsibility to protect the most vulnerable. The final chapter. In 2003, 20 years after the community's discovery, a team of documentarians located and interviewed 45 survivors. Their trajectories were diverse, some had fully integrated, others lived in assisted communities, and some remained permanently institutionalized, marked by the involuntary genetic experiment. Jacob Jackson, who had exposed the elders' deliberate knowledge, became a geneticist. "What happened to my family cannot be undone," he declared in 2010. "But we can ensure these lives were not lost in vain. Each gene identified, each child saved, is a victory over the obscurantism that kept my family in captivity for generations." The legacy of the Jackson case is an enduring awareness about the devastating risks of consanguinity and the critical importance of genetic diversity. Using sequencing technologies that didn't exist when the case came to light, scientists in 2015 managed to identify specific patterns of genetic deterioration over the 7 generations, providing unprecedented insights into how the human gene pool responds to extreme isolation. The case of the 7 generations of the Jackson family remains one of the most extreme and well-documented examples of the effects of prolonged consanguinity in humans. It is a story of suffering, but also of resilience, scientific discovery, and redemption through knowledge. If you watched until here, it's because you care about these cases that mark families forever. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel to become part of our community that isn't afraid to face humanity's most difficult truths.